So now that you guys have practiced creating value, you've practiced smooth shading, so now we're moving on to putting everything together and making something look 3D. So these are two examples of kind of the same subject matter. Hopefully you can see the difference in the approach. This is an example of what not to do. What's the biggest difference between these two? This heavy outline. This is a big thing in drawing one. As people start their drawing experience, this might be the first time you've taken a drawing or an art class, people tend to rely on a really dark, heavy outline. Because we are going to work towards using the shadows on the objects themselves, giving us our edges, so we don't have to actually rely on a dark, heavy outline. What happens is that the dark, heavy outline actually makes it look flatter. It takes away your depth in your 3D approach. So now what we're going to look for is, where are the dark values? Where are the light values? Where are the super, super light values? Because to make something look 3D, you need a full range of values. These formulas that you practiced, you're going to try to look for them and apply them. So even something like this, a styrofoam cup, it's basically kind of a mixture of the cylinder and the cone in terms of shape. The whole idea that there's a core shadow and that there's reflected light next to it, opposite where the highlight is. So right here, if this is the cast shadow, then the core shadow would actually be right in here. So we're going to look for those. Make sure that you are looking. We talked about close observation. Let's say this is the top of a pumpkin. You might even be thinking like, you know, hey, this is what a pumpkin looks like, cartoony kind of looking, right? If you're not looking at the actual pumpkin, it's going to start looking like this, and everything's like perfect and uniform. In reality, it might look like this, because this is actually more of what the top of the pumpkin would look like. The lines actually meet up here at the stem, like the ridges. These are uneven because if something is natural, then it's not going to be perfect. Okay, there's going to be uneven parts. As we shade, there's parts that are lighter that are coming forward, and this would be something that would kind of be going backwards. A little bit of a slight ridge, but not as deep as this. The darker values are where it's going in and away from you. Highlight areas are the parts that are coming like closer to you. Careful observation. If this is just in your head what a pumpkin looks like versus actually looking at what the shape is and where are the highlights and the shadows. But you're going to set up your objects. Make sure you have light. Make sure you can see a cast shadow. Make sure you can see a core shadow. Make sure you can see highlights. But make sure that it's not lit so bright that you see. If over half of the object is highlight, you need to move your light. Same with shadow. If over half of your object is dark shadow, you need to move your lighting and work on that. A couple more examples of what not to do. Dark outline and not paying attention to the shape. So this is an example of sometimes when people say, all right, I'll do the formula, and they start thinking of things just instead of that actual rounding of the shape. So you guys are going to use all the tools we've done. When you do this project, it is a still life. So there's a reason we started with sighting and comparative measurements. So as you're looking at your own objects, you're going to do things like say, all right, what's the width of this vase compared to this vase? Yeah, these are the same. What is the neck of this vase compared to the whole thing? It's about a third. You can even say, I know I told you to overlap objects, but this space in between these objects, I can compare that to, say, like the top of this. The bottom of this I can compare to this. What's the width versus the height of this? Can I actually see this much inside the vase, or should that actually be skinnier? So don't forget to do comparative measurements. Don't forget to look at placement of objects where they overlap. So this is further down, and this is higher up. So this sphere, it was actually closer to me. This is closer to me, that's farther away. I need that space to make it look like the objects are spaced out. There's depth between them. So now you're gonna add in shading. A couple things before we get 100% into it. Let's say the light is coming from this side. There's our sun. You would not have this dark, dark outline. You're gonna have a lighter outline. This is just so you can see it. So you would actually have a lot less, but we can kind of work on this part right here and show you a little bit. So if the light's coming from here, my cast shadow would be a little bit more like right here. My core shadow would be here. This is kind of a weird round but egg kind of shape. but that's where I'm going to be heading. The other thing is that what's going to happen is that this egg is casting a shadow onto this vase. So you can kind of see this started. Even with that dark heavy outline around this object, when I start putting this darker value here, the outline disappears. So I can kind of resurrect this a little bit. Actually, if this is here, then this actually means that this cast shadow would be connecting to it. So if this is cast shadow, then we can kind of start moving on in there. Same thing here. So if I'm starting to shade, I'm going to use nice smooth shading and lighter pressure where I need it to be lighter. So this is going to be dark, but this is going to be darker. But I'm paying attention to the shape. So when you set up your objects for this project, there's one thing I gotta talk about real quickly. This project might take you a couple of days. You might not be able to leave your objects laying around on the kitchen table or by the windowsill for 3 days without disrupting your family. So what I want you to do, set up your objects. Maybe you could put a little piece of tape at the bottom where just like, a little piece of tape here, a little piece of tape here. You don't have to do the whole thing. But maybe you could put just a little bit of like a Post-it note, anything like that, that wouldn't mark up the table, so that you can put the objects back the next day in the same place. You'll figure out the lighting and all of that and match it up. Put that down. If you need to take a picture of it, take a picture of it. But this is the part I need you guys as drawing students to honor this. You need to work from 3D objects. You need to look from real objects. Obviously, I'm not at home with you and I cannot enforce that. But what happens is if I'm looking at 3D objects, I have to figure out how to make something that's 3D in reality and translate it into 2-dimension, because I'm making a drawing out of it. So the process of making something 3D into 2D, transferring that onto paper, is a drawing skill. It's a visual interpretation of space that you need to practice. If you take a picture of your still life and you work from the photo is basically 2-dimensional. The photo will compress space. The photo will tell you where this is and where this is. If you want to use the photo as a reference to see how you're doing, that's totally fine. But don't just draw straight from the photo, because it'll actually hinder your improvement in your drawing skills. So you do want to work from the real life objects. Observational drawing is the technique you're working with. So you need to actually pay attention to the physical space. Obviously, I can't enforce that. Know that you're going to honor it and work towards it. Okay. So if this is my initial sketch, I still have a lot of loose exploratory lines. I've done my comparative measurements. I've checked this versus this, and this and this are just about the same, etc. So the cast shadows are in there. There's a little bit of cast shadow here. So the way for me to tell the difference between this object and this object is that I need to look at these two objects and which one is lighter or which one is darker. If I look at the photograph, there's a lot of highlight here, and this side of the hydro flask is darker. So when I start my shading, I know this is a good solid shadow. I can start making this shadow on the water bottle, and because of it, the actual shape of the vase is going to come out without outlining it. I can't stop here unless that is how the shadow is, because otherwise now I just made a really thick outline. This object right about here, and if it helps to kind of map them out, you can do that. I'm just kind of doing it to kind of show you guys. That is more of where my core shadow is going to be. This is the core shadow. This is like a cast shadow onto this object, right? So then I could just kind of work this into my core shadow. So as I match that up to that other cast shadow, if I need to darken my core shadow, excuse me, then I can. But I'm also going to transition this to be darker, this is going to be lighter, and this is part of that cast shadow in here. So if you see a very distinct edge on your shadows, then you will have a harder edge. You don't have to transition out of that. So say if this is a core shadow here, this part might be a little bit darker with the reflected light, so I just kind of keep layering this over. But maybe this part where this vase is kind of creating a shadow here, maybe I have that edge. We got to go back to the source, the still life, to double check where that is. If I saw that distinctive an edge, then I definitely want to have that harder edge transition instead of a softer edge transition. But see how it's the shadow behind gives me this object. I can start shading this one really lightly down here, because the highlight was sitting up there, so I'm going to leave that white. Okay, and there's a light shape here. When you're doing a curved object, you know, if you want to try curving your shading as you're doing this, sometimes it helps to rotate the paper. I tend to shade better in one movement than being able to move my hand around. I sometimes will even do this. Say this part's like a little bit darker. I can come down here and kind of get that movement back and forth. I'm going to be able to do that better upside down than if I kept it right side up. You can kind of see where this is going. We'll come back to it. So now you can kind of see that I tried to show you two different techniques here on this object. So you can see I'm building up my values. On this side of the vase, I'm trying to go in a little bit of a curved motion. If I was tracing this vase with my finger, what would be the movement? These edges, kind of round this, and I can kind of come back in with a little bit of a different direction and smooth that up. So even though I curve it to match up the shape, I still sometimes need to come back with like that little bit of a vertical almost approach. But see how I'm still doing this? I'm still following the curve of the vase. So even if I'm coming here, I can come over this way. This is my darkest shadow anyways, so I can still come back here and get my core shadow. So I wasn't too worried about that overlap because I'm going to still come back and get that darker value anyways. But what I want you guys to notice is, see right here, I was just shading like this. Straight back and forth. And that is totally fine. It works, right? But if I can come in here and get this direction for the actual like curve of the vase, it's going to help. Or like we talked about, same thing, if I were to trace it this way, I can actually curve it this way from top to bottom. And that's also going to give me a shadow that's going to be going slightly darker down here, because it's going to be much darker down there at the bottom. So now I can switch back to 6B or 4B pencil. I tend to use my 4B a lot. I started out, this was an HB pencil, this is a 6B pencil. 2B and 4B are honestly like my kind of go-to pencils. 6B definitely for getting my cast shadows and my core shadows real good. But for me personally, I don't like working with H pencils all that much. So I tend to favor my 2B and my 4B pencils quite a bit. Those are the ones I will go through a lot faster. 2H pencils definitely have a purpose. So like I said, you can think about like how this vase is curving this way. You can think about how it's curving this way. And that's going to also help. So the direction of your pencil strokes, right now it's kind of a hot mess because I have 3 different techniques kind of going on. But you can see how that part isn't helping it look 3D as much as these curved lines. I can go back and forth like this for the curved line, but I probably want to make it a little bit longer of a movement instead of that short one. But I can also come here, get the kind of vertical core shadow going, because that is the structure of the vase. Giving you some options, talking you through a couple of different techniques. So now your goal is to do this. Sorry, it's a long video, sorry about that. But if you've been paying attention, one of the key things is to not outline, and you're going to rely on shadow and highlight. And if you haven't really noticed, you're building up these shadows. As you're learning, I kind of modeled it. I started with the darkest shadow. Do you feel comfortable? Like, here's my core shadow. I'm going to start right here with my core shadow. That's great. And then you do a little less pressure and you start easing out of that. Pay attention to highlights, shadows. This is the inside of this vase. I can see a little bit into it to give me that 3D effect. There's shadow underneath here, where the lip of the vase is. So I'm going to really pay attention to where the shadows are, the careful placement. We talked about that. Think of that pumpkin that I showed you at the beginning. But you notice I'm building up my values. I'm not just going the different parts. I'm coming back, I'm integrating them. So this is a slow process of building up shadow. You're not just gonna start and get this done in one sitting unless you're gonna be here for a few hours. All right, you are going to try and get full value, 3D approach. You need 3 objects. You need a light source. Don't write the light source on it. You are gonna ground your objects. So all that means is that you're just drawing like basically where an edge of something is. Make sure that your edge is where the objects could actually sit on it. You couldn't do your edge right here or the object would be floating. So just kind of draw like where the edge of the desk looks good to you. You can totally use your own judgment on that. So you're gonna ground your objects. You're gonna do all 3 and you're gonna aim for 8 to 10 different values on your objects. You're gonna come in here and smooth your transitions and work towards getting 3D effect through shading. Keep white for highlights. You need the white for highlights. Don't forget your cast shadows either. Last thing, how big do your objects have to be? Your paper's slightly bigger, but you notice that when I sketched this out, I tried to fill up the page to a certain extent. It's okay if you have a little bit of extra space at the top, got a little bit of extra space here, got a little bit of extra space here. Have your objects fill up most of your page, your subject matter. Don't have more than about 2 inches. You know, if you're off centering, it's about to have a little bit. Give yourself at least an inch of space. We'll talk more about composition another day, but how do you like the objects to fit? I just naturally kind of off-centered this one because this is kind of like the vase I like the best and it's my focal point and I like to kind of off-center that. So that's why else this is going to have a little bit of extra. Don't forget about your cast shadow because that's part of the subject too. All right, go to it. Draw a full still life in full value.